So today I'm going to be reading a passage from the book of Esther. A little background on the book of Esther. Depending on what tradition you grew up in, it might be called the Megillah. But the book of Esther, this story that I think is ripe for our time. And there's some key characters, and you won't hear about some of the characters in this part, but perhaps I'll come back to them. Mordecai is Esther's uncle. Xerxes is the king. Xerxes ruled from India to Kush, present-day Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. And in addition to Esther, her uncle Mordecai, Xerxes the king, there's also Haman, the antagonist in the story, who is plotting to destroy the Jews. So Esther in chapter 4 learns about Haman's plot to destroy the Jews. And Haman is one of the king's highest officials. When Mordecai learned of everything that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. And he came back as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. In each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and mourning rites, and many had sackcloth and ashes spread out as a bed. Then Esther's attendants and her eunuchs came and informed her, and the queen was seized by great fear. And she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, so that he would remove his sackcloth from him, but he did not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach from the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this mourning was and why it was happening. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the elimination of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict, which had been issued in Susa for their annihilation, so that he might show Esther and inform her, and to order her to go into the king to implore his favor and plead with him for her people. So Hathach came back and reported Mordecai's words to Esther. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king in the inner courtyard who is not summoned, he has only one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that they may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. And they reported Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, liberation and rescue will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants also will fast in the same way. And then I will go in to the king, which is not in accordance with the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. For such a time as this. In May 2017, I visited Sachsenhausen, the concentration camp where Hitler's hellions first tested the gas chambers and other methods utilized during the Holocaust. Beautiful middle-class homes sat a stone's throw away from where structures were erected for ultimate erasure, eradication, extermination. Perhaps one can be forgiven for failing to see architecture, but people? Folks rounded up for their religion, their politics, their sexuality, were hoarded onto trains and marched through the cobblestone paved streets of a suburb, not unlike Newark. People marched through these suburban streets with yellow stars emblazoned on their cloaks. My tour guide, a dude from Indiana whose student visa had run out long ago but stayed hooked on German smokes and German women, said of the suburbanites, "These were good people," as though he was obliged to humanize the horror of silence and indifference, religious indifference, human indifference. Good people get other people killed, fine people on both sides, as a monster said about the folks who terrorized Charlottesville, Virginia, where I lived before I moved here. Both sidesism gets people killed too. As I rode the train that day from Berlin, I felt sober. You see, I had experienced a bit of trauma in that past year, and that's neither here nor there. It's just to say this. I wasn't sure whether for the first time since leaving a job and community that I had both loved and nurtured for 8 years, more on that later, I would utterly lose it at Sachsenhausen. That is, have the deep crying breakdown that had not yet come, the inconsolable sobs that accompany deep, devastating, life-altering loss. Up to that point, I had mostly felt numb, like a robot, going through the motions, yet trying to maintain my edge, the one that tells you, this is wrong, and I have to do something. I cannot be a bystander to history. On that train ride, I thought back to the previous summer. Nearly 1 year prior, I had visited Syrian refugees in northern Turkey who had managed to escape the hell of war at the hands of their brutal dictator, which our new national intelligence official met with. But most were not. I met widows of war caring for orphans of war. I'll say that again. I met widows of war caring for orphans of war. Some of the orphans were their own children, but most were not. Yet there they were, traumatized, vulnerable, the least, the last, caring for the vulnerable, and telling me that they wish they could do more, telling me to remember them. Upon hearing that I teach about them and pray for them and press my government to do more, they cried that someone remembered them. Remember us was all they asked. I thought back to the summer of 2014, in which I visited within 2 months Rwanda, 20 years after the commencement of the genocide, and South Africa, 20 years after the end of apartheid. I met people in both places who were fighting like hell for reconciliation, not the reconciliation that good people talk about, the kind where the oppressed, the victims, the colored, the Tutsis, the Japanese interned, my grandmother, me, have the onus and burden of forgiving the oppressor. But where South Africans demand, Black South Africans, that without truth there can be no reconciliation, the same kind of folk masquerading behind slogans like "Unite the Right" perpetrated apartheid, and the same kind of greedy leaders, like he who shall not be named, perpetrated the genocide on Easter Day in 1994. But forgiveness and reconciliation in Rwanda and South Africa is not cheap. Ask the Rwandan woman I met, who was left for dead, who met her would-be murderer on a hill. He pretended not to see her, but she called out to him, "Do you recognize me?" He said, "I don't know you, lady." She said, "Sure you do. You told me that my God died that Easter day and I would die too. You pierced me here. You pierced me here. Next time you see me, young man, look at me. Speak to me. I am your mother." That is embodied solidarity, friends. But forgiveness and love and neighbor are not platitudes, they are hard fought, and people die in the process. From internment camps to reservations to plantations to concentration camps to ghettos, good people turn a blind eye to the erection of structures intended to round up, isolate, and exterminate the most vulnerable bodies of the day, whatever the day. They refuse to challenge the narratives of empires and white docile Jesuses and comfortable capitalism that have colonized their imaginations. My loves, the United States is perilously close to mass violence of this ilk, condoned by, if not organized by, our government. It's certainly clear that the ideologies that spurred these events, that good people like to believe they're immune from, are rampant in the White House, and in the public. This is the United States. There is no longer a then. They're here. Seriously. Enter Esther. Esther was an orphan. Mordecai was her uncle, her parents dead. She was raised by someone who had no duty to care for her, like the Syrian women. Esther and her uncle were in exile in Susa, the most powerful kingdom of the day. They were political persona non grata. Read, without papers. She was a religious minority, a monotheist worshiping a jealous God in a polytheistic society. We didn't read all of Esther, but Esther, if it's not obvious, in a gendered time, she was a woman. She was rounded up, given a Brazilian wax. Dang, I messed up my joke. She was rounded up, given a Brazilian wax and a year-long facial, 6 months of myrrh oil, and 6 months of balsam oil. Literally. She was prepared to be presented to the king for his pleasure. In the parlance of our day, she was trafficked. Yes, she was an orphan, but her uncle kept her in his prayers. And the whole time she was being prepared for the king's pleasure, he paced back and forth daily in front of the king's palace. She had community, and her community had her. She was ensconced in a kingdom of rampant excess, but never forgot her identity, although she kept it hidden for strategic reasons, not for shame of her origins or her people, Ashe. She spoke the names of her ancestors. She knew who she was, and she knew where she came from. December 2015 was the height of the presidential campaign season. By then, Donald Trump had declared his intent to build a border wall to keep out bad hombres, code Mexicans. He had declared his disdain for immigrants, read Muslims. He had condoned and encouraged violence in his rallies. And while he had yet to be caught in his diatribe about grabbing women by the you-know-what, his character was showing. He had colluded with the Christian right and the alt-right, and in the wake of San Bernardino, the president of Liberty University, a Christian university, told his students during chapel service to end those Muslims before they end us. Jerry Falwell Jr. had also allowed Trump to use that same pulpit to announce his candidacy. On December 10th of 2015, I was a professor at an elite liberal arts college just outside of Chicago. The college happens to be Christian, proudly touting its history as a stop on the Underground Railroad, and the fact that it was the first institution of higher learning in Illinois to admit a black man. I was the first African-American woman in the history of this proud abolitionist university to earn tenure. But very soon, very unrelated to my own campus, the kind of evangelical 81% that elected Donald Trump had my head on a proverbial platter. In 2015, I made a statement on Facebook on a cold winter night. If you can believe it, it wasn't snowing, but this is what I said. I don't love my Muslim neighbor because she or he is American. I love my Muslim neighbor because she or he deserves love by virtue of their human dignity. I stand in human solidarity with my Muslim neighbor because we are formed of the same primordial clay, descendants of the same cradle of humankind, a cave in Sterkfontein, South Africa, that I had the privilege to descend into to plumb the depths of our common humanity in 2014. I stand in religious solidarity with Muslims because they, like me, a Christian, are people of the book. And as Pope Francis stated last week, we worship the same God. But as I tell my students, theoretical solidarity is not solidarity at all. Thus, beginning tonight, my solidarity has become embodied solidarity. As part of my Advent worship, I will wear the hijab to work at Wheaton College, to play in Chi-Town, in the airport and on the airplane to my home state that initiated one of the first anti-Sharia laws, and at church. I invite all women into the narrative that is embodied hijab-wearing solidarity with our Muslim sisters for whatever reason. A large-scale movement of women in solidarity with hijabs is my Christmas wish this year. Perhaps you are a Muslim who does not wear the veil normally. Perhaps you are an atheist or an agnostic who finds religion silly or inexplicable. Perhaps you're a Catholic or a Protestant Christian like me. Perhaps you already cover your head as part of your religious worship, but not a hijab. I added some caveats that I had spoken with the Muslim community. By the next morning, my post had gone viral. It was the last day of the semester. I had 2 classes to teach, a thesis defense to sit on, finals to prepare for, projects to grade, and of course, I was babysitting for a friend that night because that's what Aunt Larycia does. The girls asked me why I had that thing on my head. I explained what the hijab was. I talked about embodied solidarity, and they said, oh, let's sing silly songs. Let's read little books. And they didn't call me raghead or sand nigger. They have no such vocabulary of hate. As finals commenced, the proverbial poop hit the fan, and on February 6, 2016, after a difficult 2 months, Wheaton College and I parted ways. But embodied solidarity, that lives on. You see, as the grandkid of a pastor raised in the Black church, as a teenager in a Southern Baptist church youth group, and later through my intellectual and existential crises as an adult, I always admired the perseverance of Jesus and the prophets against injustice as recounted in the books of the Bible. Prophets spoke truth to power. Amos said, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Isaiah said, is this not the fast I choose to break the bonds of injustice, to set the prisoner free? Like Mordecai, who said to Esther, even if you don't stand up, liberation will come for the Jews from elsewhere. Like Esther, who says, if I perish, I perish. Like Mordecai, pacing back and forth, keeping watch. Mordecai also, in the Esther story, foils an assassination plot and was the target of Haman's revenge, but instead became a DEI hire to save the entire community. The Jews were eventually saved. Friends, they've been coming for some of us. Some of you think you're immune. Some of you think it won't happen to you. But radical acts of embodied solidarity and hospitality are everywhere. My widowed Syrian friends in Turkey, like Esther, when power oppresses, you may fear some aspects of the moment, but remember, you and I were made for such a time as this. Thank you.